Greetings and welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. In this special segment of Pennsylvania in Focus, I am joined by Pennsylvania editor Kristen Smith. Kristen, we had an opportunity to do a deep dive into hundreds of millions of dollars in research funding grants granted to colleges and universities through Biden-era spending bills like the $280 billion CHIPS and Science Act and the more than $700 billion Inflation Reduction Act. We partnered with DOJ-style investigator Jenica Pounds, who analyzed more than $250 million in federal grants received by the University of Pennsylvania, more than $263 million to Penn State, and more than $79 million to Pitt between 2020 and 2025. We wanted to determine if these massive grants were worth the huge amount of taxpayer dollars. What we found is that it's really too early to determine whether the outcomes from that spending will prove fruitful, but we did discover a larger debate within the academic community about whether the federal government should be funding such research at all. With the administration of President Donald Trump looking to cut federal spending across the board, including at colleges and universities that he says promote woke ideology, this is a timely conversation to have. Kristen, tell us a little bit more about the project.
A deep dive, I think, is an understatement. Jenica really walked here so that we in Pennsylvania in Focus could run through this data. We're looking at thousands of grants that were awarded to these three universities. The grant data itself showed how much money was awarded, what the projects were about, and to which university. Jenica went the extra step of trying to measure the impact of these grants by listing how many citations in academic journals and things like that were. But as you mentioned at the top, it's still too early to know how far or how much impact that these grants really have. So given that limitation that we had in Pennsylvania, we started going to different academic researchers to kind of pick their brains on how they would gauge the effectiveness of a grant, how the grant process works, the amount of money that's being spent, and how Donald Trump's cuts to research funding, how that's really going to impact them. And there's a couple things that we found right off the top. First of all, the three universities that we looked at, two are public, which is Penn State and Pitt, but then one is a private Ivy League institution, which is the University of Pennsylvania. And that's a really important distinction because their financials are very different. The pictures are very different, how they interact with federal grant research and student loan funding and student aid grants. It's all very different. So we decided to kind of split the schools into those two different groups. And then moving on from there, we started to take a look more at some of these grants that they were getting. An example of some were Penn State received $673,000 to study unintended consequences of specific immigration enforcement. There was a $480,000 award to the University of Pittsburgh to study countering COVID-19 misinformation. There was a $300,000 award to Penn State to advance resilience in low-income housing data using climate change. So these are just some of the awards that were given. But what's important to note here is that through our research and our talking to different sources, what we found is that the applications themselves and the awards really aren't telling the whole story in any way at all.
Yeah, so many of the grant, and Jenica analyzed hundreds of these grant awards from those two major spending bills that came after the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of them were, healthcare related, how to improve outcomes and study these things. But the ones you mentioned, and there are more like them, some people, some critics would question, why are we spending one you did mention here, the one that I was looking at was a $313,000 award to the University of Pittsburgh to explore how teaching and learning occur within two Native Alaskan dance and drumming groups. I mean, it's fair to criticize something like that, would you say?
Absolutely. I believe that this is what DOJ and the Trump administration is going after when they look at the broader spending. The reason that they're targeting projects like this is, as we know, Trump is embarking on a wider campaign to reduce or cut DEI spending in total. And so that these grants definitely fall within that category of more DEI culturally related research projects. And so one of the big criticisms of this, particularly from Doge style researchers and supporters, is that, we're spending all this money on projects like this that may not be giving us the same returns as, say, COVID-19 vaccines, which the University of Pennsylvania did develop a few years ago, or gene editing, or, some of the major defense and national security projects that Penn State undertakes, for example, and that they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on this, and tuition is continuing to rise, enrollment is continuing to drop. Meanwhile, these universities can rely on a steady and constant stream of federal income through grants, through student aid, through student loans, and they don't have as much of an incentive to really reduce spending or to make their programs more affordable and competitive. And this is definitely an issue we saw addressed at the congressional level a few weeks ago, when the House really dug into this issue of our Ivy Leagues conspiring to make college less affordable to kind of support their very expensive and lucrative administrative structure that brings their top administrative employees and presidents millions of dollars. And we see that sort of structure in the public universities as well. But the problem here is that the public universities and even your smaller colleges, your state-run colleges, all the way down to community colleges, they're hugely impacted by how Ivy Leagues may be raising the price. It's like this trickle-down effect. And so you're seeing this issue of the cost going up and up and up, and colleges not taking enough accountability to find ways to limit student costs, because some of them just frankly don't have to. When you look at a university like the University of Pittsburgh, they have a $22 billion endowment. Again, their student body is very, there's families that can afford to pay that large tuition. It's increased 45% over the last 10 years. And when you're looking at just annual tuition, it's $68,000 at University of Pennsylvania. But then when you add room and board, you're looking at over $100,000. You have families that can afford that. Then you have, very, very low income students who are given free rides to University of Pennsylvania and their Ivy League schools, which I think a lot of people would agree that is an appropriate use of their money. But what you have in the middle is lower income, working class, poor, all kinds of students in the middle who deserve the same shot at a higher education and simply are saddled with student loans, which many people would agree are very predatory in the way that they're structured. That's something else that Donald Trump is trying to attempt to change. And they're constantly they're the ones who are sharing the burden of these rising costs. And so this research project really looks deeply into that and tries to connect or find the way that research grant funding impacts this. Now, the flip side of this is that it's not all bad. They're not just like siphoning in this money and padding their bank accounts. It's not exactly what's happening. You have a lot of administrative costs that go with, taking this grant money and using it for research. And that's something that universities have to factor in to how much a grant is going to cost and how much money they need to ask for. Then that's federally regulated. So now you've got a regulation issue compounding some of the more cultural and long-standing historical issues that are impacting tuition.
Of course, with that that increased administration costs, that increases the overall operating expenses of these colleges and universities. And we're focused on these 3 Pennsylvania colleges in this project. But this kind of funding went to dozens, maybe more than 100 colleges and universities across the country. Kristen, we talked to 2 college level researchers who come down on sort of the opposing sides of whether or not the federal government should be funding these research projects, or whether the private community should be funding these. Just briefly tell us a little bit about that debate.
So one of our first conversations was with Dr. J. Scott Turner of the National Association of Scholars. He is a retired academic researcher who was in the field for 40 years. And his feeling is that ever since the end of World War II, there's been a dramatic shift in the way that we fund grant research. Primarily before that, it was philanthropic donations. But after World War II, that's when the government really stepped in and started pouring money into universities for research. And with this became a shift in the priorities of scientists, and it's gone from discovery to production. And production is measured in different ways, but his argument is that none of them are beneficial overall. So what does productive mean in the eyes of a university seeking out grant funding? That would mean more citations in academic journals. That would mean the amount of grant money coming in. That would mean the amount of students who are being trained in a research program. A lot of these factors that, of course, go into what a successful research study looks like, but are not, in his position, the driving forces behind discovering innovation. And that really federal involvement has not only driven costs up, but reduced actual scientific discovery.
Kristen, thank you for joining us today. Listeners and viewers can read these series of stories at thecentersquare.com beginning Monday.